The Lenox globe is a unique, one-of-a-kind globe. It was crafted by a medieval cartographer in the early 1500s, and he drew from all the knowledge of the known world, and then the map maker wrote these three words at the edges of the continents as he knew them. Translated into English, the words are, "Here be dragons." Beyond the edges of what mankind knew about their world, all you could do was worry. I mean, there got to be dragons out there. Here be dragons. If you can't see it, if you don't know what's out there, if you can't overcome it, if it's a fearful, unknown experience, if you can't explain it away, if it's going to spell trouble or suffering or pain or sorrow or just simply the unexpected, you might as well assume they're like dragons, lurking out in the unknown, unseen, unexpected future. You might as well just write on the pages of your unknown future, "Here be dragons." There's nothing you can do but worry. Even though we know dragons aren't out there lurking at the edges of our continents, this hasn't given the world's population any kind of antidote. In fact, there's always some new dragon out there of some shape or form. I did a little digging and found the results of new research proving that anxiety didn't stay back there in the early 1500s. It's on the rise, in fact, today. One news article I came across compared children's fears with adults' fears. I thought this was interesting. Children fear bad dreams. Adults fear unfulfilled dreams. Children fear doctors. Adults fear doctor bills. Children fear clowns. Well, adults fear clowns too. Studies among college students have historically shown depression to be the number one reason students seek counseling. But in this last year, in fact, for the first time ever, according to the American College Health Association, depression has now been eclipsed by anxiety. 30 years ago, a study began at UCLA, and they would ask incoming freshman students, "Do you feel overwhelmed with your life?" And when this study started 30 years ago in 1985, incoming freshmen responded, 18% of them responded, "Yes, I feel overwhelmed with life." It wasn't long before the number increased by 2010 to 29%, but in just the last 8 years, it has risen to 41%, which is significant because college students are that demographic most excited about tackling life, yet nearly 1 out of every 2 of them are going to tell you, "I feel overwhelmed with my life." Which led one popular author and blogger to write, quote, "If you're a human being living in the 21st century and you're not anxious, there's something wrong with you." The truth is, no matter how old you are, you never outgrow the ability to be anxious. There's always a dragon lurking around the edges of the unknown world you're living in. One of the realities of the spiritual life, especially for new believers who learn it early on and are surprised to discover the simple fact that coming to Christ by faith alone didn't automatically erase any future dragon from lurking around the edges on the map of our thoughts, our hearts, our lives. If that were the case, Jesus would never have needed to preach on the subject to his disciples, but he did on several occasions. If that were true, the letters of the apostles wouldn't need to be written filled with exhortations to trust the providence of God, to trust the faithfulness of God, to trust the ability of God to turn whatever is happening in your life to good according to his purposes. If Christians, were automatically sort of vaccinated against any outbreak of anxiety, the Apostle Paul would never have commanded one of the most mature congregations to ever receive a letter from him to not be anxious about anything. Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. Slaying the dragon of anxiety from the first century to the 21st century is a daily part of the believer's battle. And it must be fought daily by the believer. I love the way Corrie ten Boom put this thought. She survived the concentration camp at Ravensbrück in Germany during the final months of World War II. And she made this point when she would later write, "Worry does not empty tomorrow of its sorrows, it empties today of its strength." In other words, worry doesn't change anything about tomorrow, but it really messes up your mind today. It's no surprise then that the Apostle Peter would tackle the issue of anxiety, and he does so with a very strong, demanding, powerful text where he delivers an ultimatum and an affirmation. So take your copy of his letter we've been working through here. Peter's first letter, let's pick up where we left off. We're in chapter 5 and verse 7, and all I want to do is focus on verse 7, just that one freighted phrase. First, I want you to notice the ultimatum from Peter, casting all your anxiety on him. And I need to point out that this phrase is a part of the previous verse. Notice verse 6. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on him. You got to put those together. In other words, you've allowed yourselves to be humbled by God, and you recognize daily and surrender daily under his mighty hand that he is indeed in control of everything in your life, knowing that he will, at the proper time, at the due time, at the right time, bring about some kind of reversal. We studied last Lord's Day. It might be temporary. There might be temporary relief. There might be a time in your life where, those brief snatches where you catch your breath and you might even coast a little bit. Peter doesn't say it couldn't happen now. He doesn't say it'll happen later. We do know if it doesn't happen now, it's going to happen later. In that day, when all care and all sorrow and all trouble are going to be reversed, in that eternal reversal where the cross will give way to the crown. But in the meantime, as you humble yourself under the mighty hand of God's purposes and providence, as you do that, then you cast upon him your anxiety. In fact, Peter uses a word for anxiety, merimna, which means to be pulled apart. It means to be pulled in many directions. It means, you could render it, to be distracted. It's mental anguish. You're pulled apart from all kinds of directions. In fact, I did a little digging with Kittle as a helper in his theological dictionary of the New Testament and pulled out volume 4 and looked up this word. And it was interesting to me, before Peter ever used this word, the secular Greek world used the word often to describe the cares of life that one might brood over. They would write that these cares are the kind that disturb your sleep. Some things never change. But then unbelieving Grecians would write, quote, "The foolish try to drown these cares in love or in drink, but we know only death can free us." In other words, there's no hope. There's no solution for for the unbeliever. The dragon of anxiety is virtually undefeatable. There is no chink in his armor. You're helpless. But not so with Peter. He says, don't be pulled apart. In fact, this is not a suggestion. This is an ultimatum. He uses an imperative here. You might want to write into your text an exclamation point at the end of this phrase. Casting all your anxiety on him, exclamation point. In fact, the verb for casting here has the idea of throwing them on another. You take them off yourselves and you throw them on another. Very specific verb. By the way, it was used on one other occasion in Luke's gospel in chapter 19 and verse 35 for that event where the disciples took off their cloaks and threw them on the back of that colt upon which Jesus would ride into Jerusalem. They took off their cloaks and threw them on that colt. That's the picture. Bible scholars point out that Peter is more than likely quoting what must have been to him a favorite verse, like these little children on the video earlier, quoting these verses. David was the first to pen it in Psalm 55, where he writes, cast your burden upon the Lord and he will sustain you. And if you dig into that, and we can't spend any time hardly at all, but you dig into the context of that, and he's writing that struggling with the betrayal and attacks of close associates, he expected to defend and support him. So in other words, in David's personal struggle with concern and anxiety related to feeling entirely alone and attacked, it drove him to write under inspiration this truth. I'm going to take all of it and I'm going to put it on the shoulders of my strong Lord. You don't surrender to your circumstances, you surrender your circumstances over to the strong shoulders of your Savior, is the point. That happens to be the ultimatum for the Christian to live by. Secondly, I want you to notice the affirmation. Notice further in verse 7, because he cares for you. Because we might be tempted to think, I don't want to do that because, he doesn't want them. So Peter quickly says, let me give you an affirmation here. He actually cares for you. And by the way, just as casting all your care on him is not a suggestion, but an ultimatum. So this phrase here is not a question. It is an affirmation. There's no question mark at the end of this verse. Peter doesn't write, casting all your care on him because I think he's going to care for you, so go ahead and give it a shot. I'm hopeful he will. I don't know, question mark. No, in fact, he uses the word for care here, which involves the nuance of someone having an interest in someone else, and it carries this idea. It carries the idea of forethought. In other words, Jesus not only cares about you, but he saw that trouble, he saw that sorrow, he saw that challenge, he saw that difficulty coming in your life ahead of time. And he not only saw it ahead of time, but he cares about you, and he knew what you would need ahead of time. Like I said, this is a freighted phrase. And what did you need? It might be the courage you need to not run away from it. It might be the wisdom to know how to start over or take the next step. It might be the strength you need to face that particular dragon and trust the ultimate dragon slayer, Christ. So get this nuance from Peter's inspired pen. I know it's a little mind-bending to think about the omniscient, timeless eternality of God, but that's the nuance. That trial you are facing was itself the result of his forethought. And the care you needed in going through that trial is also a part of his forethought. God has thought about everything you would need beforehand. And that's why, as believers, whenever you do come out of that challenging chapter, you might be right in the middle of it right now. When you come through it, and if you've lived long enough in the Lord, eventually you do catch that breath, and you usually look over your shoulder and you'll see, you know what, just at the right time, this happened. Just at the right time, that word was spoken. Just at the right time, I got that amount of money I needed. Just at the right time, I got that job. Just at the right time, and we're always a little bit surprised. And so we kind of talk to each other like, you won't believe it, but at just the right time, my phone rang. At my darkest hour, a friend showed up. At the last moment possible, that package arrived. Or when I needed to know for sure, and I mean it was midnight, then it came. What do you know? What do you know? Well, Peter informs us here that it happened like that because God knew ahead of time, and God cared ahead of time, and God timed exactly what you needed ahead of time. Hudson Taylor, the aged missionary statesman, I love to illustrate his life periodically with you. If you're new in the faith, he served for nearly 50 years in China, lived with such a simple, sweet trust. He depended on the Lord for everything. In fact, soon after arriving, he lost his support back home because he decided to put on the queue, the ponytail, and adopt the dress of a Chinese teacher. Dropped his British dress. And his two associates turned on him, wrote all of his supporting churches back home, and they stopped his support. He decided not to come back. He stayed on, and at just the right moments, support would come. Well, on one occasion, Hudson Taylor, this is at the end of his ministry, he's standing at a train station, gray hair, gray beard, black suit, and he's waiting for the train, and a pastor recognized him and came over and introduced himself to him. They were getting on the same train. So they got on together, sat together for that 3 or 4 hour journey. And while they were in the middle of that journey, if you've been in Europe traveling by train, they still do it. They did it then. Here comes that meal cart. You buy your lunch, and the pastor offered to Hudson Taylor, let me buy your lunch. And Hudson Taylor agreed, thanked him. They ate lunch together and chatting, and then the conductor was coming down through the cars and reached their car, was coming to either punch or sell the ticket for that leg of the journey, and the pastor noticed Taylor hesitating. And the pastor jumped in and said, let me buy your ticket. And he bought Hudson Taylor's ticket. And then after the conductor made his way out of the coach, this pastor looked at Hudson Taylor and said, if you don't mind me asking, do you have any money? And Hudson Taylor said, none at all. And the pastor said, well, you were waiting for this train. You needed to eat. How did you know I would come along and be able to provide this for you? And Hudson Taylor gave that now famous response, and this is how he'd lived for many years. He said to this pastor, I didn't know, but my father knew. I love that. I didn't know, but my father knew. Slaying these dragons of anxieties involves obeying the ultimatum, followed up by trusting in the affirmation. And let me throw in this very quickly here. This word for anxiety is comprehensive. It stands for everything you might brood over. Even those things that you wouldn't tell somebody else because you think they might be unspiritual. But even the spiritual. Even those little things. Oh, the Lord probably didn't care about that. That's my problem. And the big things. The trivial. the significant, those things you lose sleep over, those things you brood on. If you're anxious about anything, He cares about everything. You could translate this phrase rather woodenly in the original language. It's rough to our ears, but I like the way it sounds. It would read, "To Him it is a care concerning you." You could paraphrase that to read, whatever is on your mind was on His mind first. He knows the color, the size, and the shape of every dragon you face. So what do we do about this ultimatum and this affirmation? Let me give you 4 quick action points. First, there's something you've got to do. You got to do this. You can't say, well, okay, I'm just going to wait till God takes that worry away from me. No. You place your worries on Him like the disciples took off their cloaks and put them on the back of the colt. Moment by moment. We have the habit of putting that cloak on the back of the donkey and then saying, nope, I'm going to wear it after all. And then taking it off and putting it back on the colt, that poor colt, so confused. And that's our problem. In fact, we have trouble giving our worries to Jesus because we're not sure He's going to handle them like we want Him to handle them. So I think I'm going to keep this one. Because I got a resolution in my mind. And I'm not sure it's yours. Which is another way of saying we're not humbling ourselves under the mighty hand of God. Our sovereign Lord, that comes first. Humbling ourselves under God's sovereign control precedes the casting of our anxiety upon Him. And that's significant, and it's true, isn't it? Because you're really not just handing over to Him some little worry. You're handing yourself over to Him. You're handing your family members over to Him. You're handing your future over to Him. You're handing the unknown, unseen, I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm going to give it to you over to Him. Which is interesting. I was reading Chuck Swindoll's commentary on this text, and he said, this phrase here kind of reminds me of what it would be like to bungee jump off a high bridge. At that moment, you're no longer in control. You are entirely dependent on the strength of that giant rubber band, which is why I'll never do that, by the way. The good news is Jesus is not a rubber band. He doesn't break. There's no risk when you cast yourself upon Him. Secondly, there's something you got to believe because He cares for you. Really? There's something about us that resists that. You ever thought about the fact that every religion panders to the heart of mankind? It has its adherents attempting to do all kinds of things. Why? In order to get their God to care about them. Christianity is that distinctive promise that your God already does. Still, believing this might be nothing less for you right now than an amazing declaration of trust. Right now, you're in the process of trusting God in the dark. You're walking with Him through some particular valley. I mean, you could easily write into the margins of the map of your life right now. I got to tell you, Stephen, you don't know. Here be dragons. Yes, there are dragons to be slayed, especially the dragon of anxiety. So continue to remind yourself of this affirmation. He cares for you. He cares for you. Write your name into that text. He cares for Stephen, Susan, Bill, Jim, whatever. Even when the clouds gather, He cares. And already has ahead of time about everything about you. One evangelical author wrote about one of the early experiences of an African-American pastor by the name of Gardner Taylor, who faithfully pastored for years in New York City. One of our summer series guests, so we'll have back a little later. He's now not as available. He's pastoring an African-American Presbyterian church, Richard Allen Farmer, phenomenal pianist. You may remember him. But every time Richard would come here, he'd tell me, Stephen, I want Sunday afternoon free because I'm going to go visit Dr. Gardner Taylor. I didn't know anything about Dr. Taylor. I wish I did because I probably would have joined him. He's called the Prince of American Preachers. Died at the age of 97 after retiring here in Durham. But this particular author was in one of his seminary classes he would teach periodically, and he retold the story. Gardner Taylor, let me just let him tell you. He said, I was preaching in Louisiana on one occasion during the Depression. Electricity was just coming into that part of the country, and I was out in a rural black church that had just one little light bulb hanging down from the ceiling to light up the whole sanctuary. I was young and inexperienced, but I was preaching away when in the middle of my sermon, all of a sudden, the electricity went out. And that bulb turned off. And there I was in this completely darkened little sanctuary. I didn't know what to say. I was a young preacher, I'd never experienced this before. I'm stumbling around for words. And then one of the elderly deacons sitting in the back of the sanctuary raised his voice and cried out, "Preach on, preacher. We can still see Jesus in the dark." Man, that's a great sermon all by itself. Sometimes it is only then when we can see him and see him best. But Peter is encouraging us here that even if we can't see him, he can see us. Even when we might not care all that much about him, he's deeply concerned, eternally so, with us. There's an affirmation you got to obey and believe. Third, this is something you got to practice. Something you got to practice. Every time an anxious thought comes along breathing fire down your back, you see it coming, a worry beginning to enter your mind, you practice as early, as quickly as possible, this discipline of refusal. I'm not going to take it. That's yours, Lord. I'm not going to take it. That's on you. Not going to be on me. It's going to be on you. You're continually casting, believing he is continually carrying. You're throwing onto him. You know, it occurred to me as I studied this verse, this is one of the few times in life when it's okay to throw things. Here it is. Now, I've never thrown a net as a fisherman. Some scholars believe he was thinking of that. I don't really like that analogy because that net's pulled back into the boat and we're not supposed to pull it back in the boat. I've never thrown blankets over the back of a colt either. But the imagery of throwing accurately is interesting to me, and I began to think, have I ever come close to that in some way in life? And it wasn't long before I thought back to all those baseballs I threw as a left-handed pitcher in Little League many years. In fact, it occurred to me it was in the last century. That's a really horrible thought, but that's when it was. All the teams, and I don't know how they're done now, but all the Little League teams when I was a kid were sponsored by local companies. And I was a little embarrassed because ours was sponsored by dry cleaners and had a long name, People's Cleaners. People's Cleaners. And those letters were put on our jerseys. And we were so little and that name was so long, it just kind of wrapped around us before we got to the end of it. Why couldn't it have been something cool like Nike? Because Nike had not been invented yet. That's why. I'd love to tell you, by the way, that I was a good pitcher. I wasn't. I wasn't. In fact, after a season, I asked the coach if he'd keep me at first base and never let me pitch again, and he happily agreed to do that. But I can still remember what it was like to loosen up, warm up before a game, stay limber, ice the elbow after a game, whatever. I thought about that as an analogy. There's a sense where you as a believer need to develop a good throwing arm to keep it limber, to keep your faith stretched out in prayer, to ice your thoughts in Scripture during and after a battle. At any moment, you're going to need to be able to throw worry as far away from you as you can. And not just throw it, but hit the target. It isn't just, I'm not going to deal with that. It is, Lord, this is yours. And you toss it to him. You are casting and Jesus is carrying. How do you know I'll handle it? How do you know Jesus will handle it? He said he would. How do you know he cares about it? He said he did. How do you know he's even interested in it? He said it was. Listen, if you don't believe, it's your word against his. Who are you going to believe? You or him? There's something you got to do. There's something you got to believe. There's something you got to practice. Fourth and finally, this is someone you've got to trust. When Peter writes here, because he cares for you, he changes the tense of the verb to present tense. What that means, without boring you with all the grammatical details, what that means is that Jesus never stops. Jesus never ceases caring. This is unending, ongoing, never ceasing, never slowing down, never letting up, never missing a moment, always caring. The problem is, beloved, we stop casting. Never that Jesus stops caring. The problem is we stop tossing. We stop sending that dragon to him. I'm going to handle this one on my own. How's that working? If I can dip back into my favorite biography again, there was a time when the demands of the China Inland Mission were mounting. More than 1,000 missionaries on the field, by the way. Several schools, mission outposts. Demands for funds, pressures financially that would have buried me, I'm sure, many others. On one of those occasions, he totaled up their funds in the bank and found they only had 25 cents in the mission bank account. Now, this is a long time ago, but still you'd have a hard time getting past $25. That was it. 25 cents. And he wrote a note to his wife and another to his bookkeeper and said the same thing. Quote, "We have this, 25 cents plus all the promises of God." This is what we have, 25 cents plus all the promises of God. I love to read those stories. I don't want to live those stories. I love to read them. Peter invites us, however, as believers out into the deep end of that kind of statement of faith. What are you down to? Whatever it is, you have that plus the promises of God. Oh, give me one, okay? He will never stop caring for you. So cast all your anxiety on him. Why? Because he will never stop caring.